You have no idea what you just did to my baby." The man's voice cracked with a mixture of rage and terror as scalding coffee dripped from his 6-month-old son's tiny arm, the child's screams piercing through the first-class cabin like a siren of injustice. But to understand how we got to this moment of pure horror, we need to go back to where it all began. Because sometimes the worst tragedies start with the most ordinary mornings. And sometimes the people who think they hold all the power are about to discover they've been playing a game where the rules are about to change forever. If you're watching this right now, make sure to hit that subscribe button and comment where you're watching from, because what you're about to witness is a masterclass in how one moment of cruelty can unravel an entire life, and how justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. The alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m. in the downtown Chicago hotel room. But Elijah Thompson had been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling while his 6-month-old son, Jordan, slept peacefully in the travel crib beside the king-size bed. At 36 years old, Elijah had built a reputation as one of the most formidable civil rights attorneys in the country, a man who could dismantle corporate lies and racist policies with the precision of a surgeon. But right now, he felt like nothing more than a terrified father facing the biggest fight of his life. Today wasn't about courtrooms or depositions or million-dollar settlements. Today was about proving to a family court judge that he could handle primary custody of Jordan, a battle that had been brewing since his ex-wife Monica decided that a black man traveling alone with an infant somehow made him less capable of being a father. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same legal system he'd spent his career navigating was now questioning his ability to care for his own child, but Elijah had learned long ago that life had a twisted sense of humor when it came to testing black men's resolve. He moved quietly around the room, careful not to wake Jordan as he laid out his navy blue suit, the one that made him look both approachable and authoritative in front of judges and juries. Every detail mattered today, from the Windsor knot in his burgundy tie to the way he would carry Jordan through the airport, because he knew that every person who looked at them would be making assumptions about whether he belonged in first class, whether he could afford those seats, whether he was really Jordan's father, or just some guy who'd found a baby somewhere. The morning routine was something he'd perfected over the past 6 months, since Monica had moved to Denver and started this custody battle. Formula preparation at exactly the right temperature. Diaper change with military precision. Tiny outfit selection that made Jordan look like the happiest, healthiest, most well-cared-for baby in the world. Because that's what he was, despite what Monica's lawyers were trying to claim about Elijah's work schedule and his ability to provide stability. As he fed Jordan his morning bottle, watching those bright brown eyes stare up at him with complete trust, Elijah felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with being a black father in America. Every choice he made, every place they went together, every interaction with strangers became a test of his worthiness, a referendum on his capability, a judgment on whether he deserved to keep his son. Other fathers got to just be fathers, but Elijah had to be a father and a representative of his entire race, and a symbol of responsible black masculinity, and a living argument against every stereotype that said men like him couldn't handle the job. The flight to Denver was supposed to be routine, just 3 hours in first class, where Jordan could stretch out and hopefully sleep while Elijah reviewed his custody case files one more time. He'd specifically chosen first class, not because he needed to prove anything to anyone, but because Jordan deserved the space and comfort, and because Elijah had learned that sometimes investing in a little extra respect could make the difference between a peaceful journey and a nightmare of microaggressions and suspicious stares. But as he packed their carry-on bag with practiced efficiency, double-checking that he had enough formula and diapers and the court documents that would hopefully convince a judge that Jordan belonged with his father, Elijah, couldn't shake the feeling that today was going to test him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd faced down racist judges and hostile corporate lawyers and entire government agencies. But somehow the thought of walking through that airport as a single black father made him more nervous than any courtroom battle he'd ever fought. Jordan finished his bottle and rewarded his father with one of those toothless grins that made every sleepless night worth it. And Elijah felt his resolve strengthen. Whatever the day brought, whatever assumptions people made, whatever obstacles appeared in their path, he would handle it with the dignity and grace that Jordan deserved to see in his father. Because that's what real men did. They protected what mattered most, even when the whole world was watching and waiting for them to fail. Victoria Hayes stood in front of her bathroom mirror at 4:45 a.m., applying the third layer of concealer under her eyes, trying to hide the exhaustion that had become her constant companion over the past year. At 47, she still looked professional in her crisp airline uniform, her blonde hair pulled back in the regulation style she'd perfected over 18 years of flying, but the woman staring back at her felt like a stranger wearing a costume of competence she no longer believed she deserved. The divorce had been finalized 8 months ago, and with it had gone the house in the suburbs, the financial security she'd thought was guaranteed, and the identity she'd built around being the wife of a successful insurance executive. Now she lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment 20 minutes from O'Hare, splitting custody of her 17-year-old daughter Emma with her ex-husband, watching helplessly as the girl chose to spend more and more time at her father's house with his new girlfriend, who was closer to Emma's age than Victoria's. The job that had once given her pride and purpose now felt like a daily humiliation, especially after last month's performance review where her supervisor had made it clear that passenger satisfaction scores were dropping and route assignments would be based on crew evaluations going forward. Victoria couldn't afford to lose the Denver route. It was one of the few remaining profitable runs that came with overtime pay, and Emma's college tuition bills were already piling up on her kitchen counter like accusatory reminders of everything she couldn't provide. She'd started noticing things differently over the past year, the way certain passengers seemed to expect special treatment just because they'd paid for first class, the way they looked at her like she was supposed to be grateful for their presence, instead of recognizing that she was a professional with nearly 2 decades of experience. The entitled attitudes, the subtle condescension, the way some people acted like flight attendants were just waitresses in the sky rather than safety professionals responsible for everyone's lives. It all grated on her in ways that hadn't bothered her before the divorce, before the financial pressure, before the loneliness had started eating away at her patience. The union meeting last week had focused on crew protection protocols with senior representatives reminding everyone that difficult passengers were becoming more common and that crews had every right to prioritize their own safety and the comfort of cooperative travelers. Victoria had found herself nodding along, thinking about the passengers who'd complained about her service lately, the ones who seemed to think their ticket prices entitled them to treat her like hired help, rather than a trained professional who could save their lives if something went wrong. There was a pattern she'd started to notice, though she'd never said it out loud, about which passengers were most likely to be demanding, most likely to challenge her authority, most likely to make her job harder than it needed to be. She told herself it wasn't about race or class, or any of the things her mother had whispered warnings about when Victoria was growing up in a small Michigan town where everyone looked the same and knew their place. It was just about respect, about passengers understanding that she had rules to follow and a job to do, and that some people seemed to think those rules didn't apply to them. As she drove through the pre-dawn darkness toward O'Hare, Victoria tried to shake off the anxiety that had been building all week. The Denver route was crucial for her financially, and she couldn't afford any passenger complaints or incidents that might jeopardize her standing with the airline. Emma's college acceptance letters were due any day now, and the difference between in-state and out-of-state tuition could determine whether Victoria's daughter had the future she deserved or got stuck in the same cycle of financial struggle that was slowly suffocating her mother. The parking garage at O'Hare was already busy with ground crew and early morning travelers, and Victoria found herself categorizing people as she walked toward the terminal, automatically assessing who belonged where and who might cause problems. It was a skill she'd developed over years of managing passenger expectations, but lately it felt more like a defense mechanism, a way of maintaining control in a life that seemed increasingly chaotic and unpredictable. Today's passenger manifest showed a full, first-class cabin, which meant good tip potential if she could keep everyone happy, but it also meant higher expectations and more opportunities for things to go wrong. Victoria straightened her shoulders and checked her reflection one more time in the terminal window, reminding herself that she was a professional with standards to maintain and authority that deserved respect, regardless of what any passenger might think they were entitled to. Margaret Chen had been flying incognito for so many years that she sometimes forgot what it felt like to travel as a regular passenger instead of a federal inspector conducting covert surveillance. But this morning's assignment felt different from the routine safety audits she usually performed for the Federal Aviation Administration. At 64, with silver hair and the kind of forgettable appearance that made her invisible to most people, Margaret had spent the last 15 years of her career documenting the gap between airline policies and actual crew behavior. And what she'd discovered along the way had convinced her that some problems required more than regulatory memos to fix. The file folder in her carry-on bag contained 3 incident reports involving Victoria Hayes, all submitted by passengers over the past 18 months, all involving travelers who happened to be people of color, and all dismissed by the airline's internal review process after union representatives argued that the complaints lacked sufficient evidence or witness corroboration. Margaret had seen this pattern before in other cases, the way individual incidents could be explained away or minimized until they formed a larger picture that no one wanted to acknowledge, let alone address. Her own story had taught her to recognize discrimination even when it was subtle, even when it hid behind professional policies and regulatory language. Margaret's parents had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1960s with nothing but determination and a belief that America rewarded hard work, and her father had spent 30 years as an airline mechanic at a time when Asian Americans were barely visible in aviation careers. She'd grown up hearing stories about the small indignities and casual racism that her father had endured, the way supervisors would question his competence despite his perfect safety record, the way colleagues would make jokes about his accent, even though his technical knowledge far exceeded theirs. When Margaret had started her own aviation career in the 1980s, she'd been one of only a handful of women in federal safety inspection, and certainly the only Asian American woman in her regional office. She'd learned to document everything, to build cases with mathematical precision, to present evidence so compelling that no one could dismiss it as misunderstanding or oversensitivity. Her late husband David, who'd been a commercial pilot for United Airlines, had taught her to see patterns in behavior that others might miss, to understand how small biases could compound into major safety issues when crew members let personal prejudices influence their professional judgment. David had died 5 years ago from lung cancer, probably caused by decades of breathing recycled cabin air, and his death had left Margaret with a sense of mission that went beyond regulatory compliance. He'd shared stories with her about the subtle ways that certain passengers were treated differently, the assumptions that crew members made based on appearance or accent or perceived social status, the way that airline training focused on safety procedures but never addressed the unconscious biases that could turn routine interactions into discrimination. Today's flight was supposed to be a standard evaluation of crew performance on a high-traffic route, but Margaret's instincts told her that Victoria Hayes represented something larger than an individual problem employee. The complaints in her file showed a pattern of escalating behavior, a progression from professional coldness to active hostility toward passengers who didn't meet some unstated criteria for respect and courtesy. Margaret had requested this assignment specifically because she suspected that Victoria's behavior was being enabled by a broader culture of impunity, a system where union protection and airline policies combined to shield crew members from accountability. As she settled into her economy seat and prepared for the flight to Chicago, Margaret activated the discreet recording equipment that federal inspectors were authorized to use during undercover operations. Her phone was positioned perfectly to capture interactions in the first-class galley. Her notebook was ready to document any policy violations she observed, and her years of experience had taught her to recognize the warning signs that preceded serious incidents. Margaret had learned long ago that the most important changes in aviation safety often came from documenting individual failures rather than trying to reform entire institutions. And today, she was prepared to be the kind of witness that David would have wanted someone to be for him during all those years when his colleagues thought his calm professionalism was somehow less valuable because of where his parents had been born. The first-class boarding process at O'Hare was supposed to be seamless, a choreographed dance of privilege and efficiency that justified the premium prices. But Margaret Chen could already see the subtle ways that Victoria Hayes was categorizing passengers before they even reached their seats. From her position in 4B, Margaret watched as Victoria's smile brightened for the elderly white couple in 1A, how her posture straightened and her voice warmed when she welcomed the businessman in 2C, who wore a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and how her expression shifted almost imperceptibly when Elijah Thompson appeared in the galley entrance carrying baby Jordan. Victoria didn't say anything overtly discriminatory, didn't do anything that would show up in a harassment complaint or training violation, but Margaret had been documenting these micro-interactions for long enough to recognize the language of bias that hid in plain sight. The way Victoria's greeting to Elijah was just a half-second shorter than the ones she'd given other passengers, the way her eyes flickered from his face to his boarding pass and back again as if double-checking that he really belonged in first class. The way she positioned herself slightly closer to the galley wall when he passed, creating a physical barrier that forced him to navigate more carefully with the baby carrier. Elijah seemed to notice the subtle hostility, but Margaret watched him make the calculated decision that every person of color learned to make in these situations, whether to address the disrespect directly and risk being labeled as aggressive, or to ignore it and hope that silence would prevent escalation. He chose silence, settling into seat 4A with the practiced grace of someone who'd learned to move through unwelcoming spaces with dignity intact, adjusting Jordan's carrier with the careful movements of a father who knew that every action was being scrutinized and judged. Dr. Patricia Williams, the pediatrician in seat 3B, had apparently been observing the same dynamics because Margaret caught her making eye contact with Elijah and offering one of those subtle nods that served as silent solidarity between people who recognized shared experiences of discrimination. James Morrison in 1A was busy with his laptop and phone calls, seemingly oblivious to the tension that was building in the cabin, but Margaret made a mental note to watch his reactions as the flight progressed, because bystander responses often proved crucial in determining how incidents escalated or de-escalated. The boarding process continued with Victoria maintaining her professional facade while consistently treating passengers differently based on what appeared to be her personal assessment of their worthiness for first-class service. Margaret documented the way Victoria's tone became slightly more clipped when addressing Elijah, how she found reasons to hover near his seat and remind him about noise policies and safety regulations that she hadn't mentioned to other passengers with children, how she positioned herself to have clear sight lines to his section while preparing for departure procedures. Jordan was being remarkably well behaved for a 6-month-old, sleeping peacefully through most of the boarding chaos, but Margaret could see Victoria watching the baby carrier with the kind of anticipatory irritation that suggested she was expecting problems rather than hoping for a smooth flight. This was exactly the kind of situation that Margaret's training had taught her to recognize as a precursor to serious incidents. When crew members developed negative expectations about specific passengers and began looking for justifications to act on those assumptions. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began taxiing toward the runway, Margaret noticed that Victoria had positioned herself at the forward galley in a way that gave her an unobstructed view of Elijah and Jordan, despite the fact that there were other passengers in first class who might have needed attention. The flight attendant's body language suggested hypervigilance rather than professional attentiveness, the kind of focused observation that police officers might use when they'd already decided someone was a threat rather than a customer deserving equal service. The captain's announcement about expected flight time and weather conditions was routine, but Margaret found herself paying more attention to the subtle ways that crew members were preparing for what should have been a standard 3-hour flight to Chicago. Victoria's interactions with her junior colleague Sarah Kim revealed a hierarchical dynamic where the younger woman seemed intimidated by Victoria's seniority and unwilling to question her judgment, even when her facial expressions suggested discomfort with some of the senior attendants' comments and attitudes. Margaret had seen this pattern before in cases that eventually led to serious incidents, when problematic crew members were enabled by colleagues who prioritized workplace harmony over passenger safety and equal treatment. The documentation phase of her investigation was proceeding exactly as she'd expected, but she found herself hoping that this flight would be different, that Victoria would recognize her professional obligations and treat all passengers with the respect they deserved. But as the engines spooled up for takeoff and Jordan stirred in his carrier, Margaret noticed Victoria's expression shift to something that looked uncomfortably like anticipation, and she realized that she might be about to witness exactly the kind of incident that had brought her onto this flight in the first place, the kind of moment that could transform routine federal documentation into evidence for a criminal investigation. The flight reached cruising altitude without incident, but Margaret Chen could feel the tension in the cabin building like atmospheric pressure before a storm, with Victoria Hayes moving through the first-class section like someone who was actively looking for problems rather than trying to prevent them. The beverage service should have been a straightforward routine, but Margaret watched as Victoria's professionalism became increasingly selective, her warm efficiency reserved for passengers who met whatever criteria she was using to determine worthiness of respect. Sarah Kim, the junior flight attendant, was trying to assist with the service, while obviously struggling with her senior colleague's attitude, and Margaret could see the younger woman's discomfort growing as Victoria made increasingly pointed comments about passenger expectations and entitlement. During a brief moment, when they were both in the galley, Margaret overheard Victoria's complaint about passengers who brought babies into first class and expected special treatment, a comment that was clearly directed at Elijah and Jordan, even though the infant had been sleeping peacefully for most of the flight. Dr. Patricia Williams had apparently reached her limit with the obvious bias she was witnessing, because Margaret watched her lean slightly toward Elijah's seat and quietly offer assistance with anything he might need for Jordan, a gesture of professional courtesy that also served as subtle defiance of Victoria's hostile attitude. The pediatrician's intervention seemed to irritate Victoria further, adding another layer to the growing tension as the flight attendant realized that her behavior was being noticed and quietly challenged by other passengers. James Morrison had finally looked up from his business calls and laptop work long enough to observe the dynamics in the cabin, and Margaret could see him becoming increasingly uncomfortable as he recognized the differential treatment that Elijah was receiving. The businessman's growing awareness was important because witness testimony from other first-class passengers would carry significant weight if this situation escalated to the point where formal complaints or legal action became necessary. Jordan woke up as they reached cruising altitude, but instead of crying or becoming fussy, he remained calm and alert, making the soft sounds that healthy babies make when they're comfortable and secure. Elijah was clearly an experienced father who knew how to anticipate his son's needs, offering a bottle and checking the diaper with efficient movements that demonstrated competence rather than the chaos that Victoria seemed to be expecting and hoping for. The first real escalation came when Victoria approached Elijah's seat during the initial beverage service and made a pointed comment about noise policies, despite the fact that Jordan hadn't made any disruptive sounds and was actually quieter than several of the adult passengers who were conducting phone conversations and business discussions. Margaret documented the interaction carefully, noting how Victoria's voice carried just enough authority to sound professional while her tone conveyed clear hostility and assumption of future problems. Margaret could see Elijah making another one of those calculated decisions that people of color had to make constantly in professional settings, whether to respond to the microaggression directly and risk confirming stereotypes about aggressive behavior, or to maintain his dignity through silence and hope that his composure would eventually shame the perpetrator into better conduct. His choice to remain calm and simply acknowledge Victoria's comment with a polite nod showed remarkable restraint, but Margaret could see the strain in his expression and knew that this kind of constant vigilance was exhausting for anyone who had to live with it daily. The atmosphere in first class was becoming increasingly uncomfortable as other passengers began to notice Victoria's behavior and react with varying degrees of awareness and concern. Dr. Williams was maintaining a protective presence near Elijah and Jordan. James Morrison was starting to pay attention to interactions instead of focusing solely on his work, and even the elderly couple in 1A seemed to sense that something was wrong with the crew dynamics, though they appeared uncertain about how to respond. Victoria's frustration was becoming more visible as her attempts to provoke a reaction from Elijah continued to fail, and Margaret recognized this as a dangerous turning point where crew members often escalated their behavior because subtle discrimination wasn't producing the desired effect. The flight attendant's body language suggested someone who was building toward a confrontation rather than trying to maintain professional service standards, and Margaret found herself preparing mentally to intervene if the situation moved beyond documentation into active emergency territory. The galley conversations between Victoria and Sarah were becoming more heated, with the senior attendant clearly trying to enlist her younger colleague in her negative assessment of Elijah and Jordan, while Sarah appeared increasingly uncomfortable with both the bias she was witnessing and the pressure to participate in it. Margaret had seen this pattern in other cases where problematic employees tried to normalize their discrimination by convincing co-workers to share their perspectives and validate their actions. As the beverage service continued, Margaret noticed Victoria spending an unusual amount of time preparing coffee orders, checking and rechecking the temperature settings on the thermal carafes while making increasingly agitated comments about passengers who didn't appreciate the level of service they were receiving. The combination of personal stress, professional frustration, and obvious racial bias was creating exactly the kind of volatile situation that Margaret's training had taught her to recognize as a precursor to serious incidents that could harm passengers and end careers. The moment of crisis arrived with the mundane predictability that characterized most aviation disasters, starting with something as simple as a coffee order, and escalating through a series of small decisions that transformed routine service into a catastrophe that would destroy lives and change an industry. Victoria Hayes had been building toward this confrontation for the entire flight, her frustration and bias coalescing into a dangerous combination of entitlement and resentment that made her see Elijah Thompson not as a passenger deserving professional service, but as a target for all the anger and disappointment that had been consuming her life since the divorce. When Elijah politely requested coffee during the beverage service, his tone was respectful and his manner was courteous. But Margaret Chen could see Victoria's reaction shift immediately into something that went far beyond professional irritation, into personal hostility. The flight attendant's response wasn't about airline policies or service standards or passenger safety. It was about power and control and the need to prove that she still had authority over something in a life where everything else seemed to be spiraling beyond her grasp. The thermal carafe containing freshly brewed coffee was heated to 195 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause serious burns within seconds of contact with skin, and airline protocols required careful handling to prevent exactly the kind of accident that Margaret was about to witness. Victoria's training had covered proper beverage service procedures dozens of times, emphasizing the importance of stable positioning and controlled pouring, especially during potential turbulence. But her emotional state had progressed far beyond the point where professional competence could override personal dysfunction. Margaret watched in growing horror as Victoria approached Elijah's seat with the coffee service, her movements sharp and aggressive rather than smooth and controlled. Her attention focused more on the passenger's face than on the dangerous liquid she was handling. The minor turbulence that struck the aircraft at that moment was barely noticeable to experienced travelers, certainly nothing that should have affected a veteran flight attendant's ability to maintain control of beverage service. But Victoria's emotional state had compromised her physical coordination and professional judgment. What happened next unfolded with the terrible clarity that accompanies life-changing moments, every detail burned into memory with perfect precision. Victoria's hand slipped, not because of the turbulence, but because her attention was divided between the pouring motion and her need to maintain hostile eye contact with Elijah, her grip on the thermal carafe loosening at the exact moment when control was most critical. The stream of scalding coffee missed the ceramic mug, completely splashing instead across Elijah's chest and onto the baby carrier where 6-month-old Jordan was sleeping peacefully. The infant's scream cut through the cabin like a fire alarm, a sound of pure agony that made every passenger freeze in recognition of something terribly wrong. Elijah's roar of shock and pain was immediately overwhelmed by his paternal panic as he realized that the burning liquid had soaked through Jordan's clothing and was searing his tiny arm and shoulder, the baby's delicate skin already turning red from contact with coffee, hot enough to cause second-degree burns within seconds of exposure. Margaret found herself moving before conscious thought could intervene, her federal training kicking in as she reached for the emergency supplies that should have been immediately provided by crew members, but weren't being offered by Victoria, who stood frozen with the coffee pot still in her hand, her expression cycling through shock and then defensive anger as the magnitude of what she'd done began to register. Dr. Patricia Williams was already out of her seat and moving toward the crisis, her medical training making her the most qualified person on the aircraft to assess Jordan's injuries, while James Morrison fumbled for his phone to document what was clearly going to become a legal and public relations disaster. Elijah's desperate attempts to remove Jordan from the soaked carrier while simultaneously trying to assess the extent of his son's burns created a scene of controlled chaos that revealed both his competence as a father and the severity of the situation they were facing. His demands for ice and medical assistance were met not with professional emergency response, but with Victoria's immediate shift into defensive mode, her training and liability protection overriding any human compassion or acknowledgement of the harm she'd caused to an innocent child. The cabin atmosphere transformed instantly from routine travel to emergency response, but Margaret could already see Victoria beginning the process of blame deflection that would turn this from an accident requiring accountability into a confrontation where the victim would somehow become the perpetrator. The flight attendant's body language and facial expressions suggested someone who was preparing to fight, rather than someone who was trying to help an injured infant, and Margaret realized that her documentation role was about to become something much more serious as she prepared to serve as the witness who could prevent a cover-up and ensure that justice was served. The transformation of the first-class cabin from a space of quiet luxury into a scene of medical emergency and moral reckoning happened with shocking speed, as Jordan's continued screams of pain cut through every conversation and forced every passenger to confront the reality that they were witnessing something that would haunt them for years to come. Dr. Patricia Williams reached Elijah and Jordan first, her medical training allowing her to assess the situation quickly, while other passengers sat frozen in the kind of shock that accompanies unexpected tragedy, their comfortable assumptions about routine air travel shattered by the sound of an infant in agony. Elijah's attempts to remove Jordan's coffee-soaked clothing revealed the extent of the burns on the baby's left arm and shoulder, angry red patches of skin that would require immediate cooling and professional medical attention to prevent permanent scarring and infection. "Doctor," Williams began applying cool water from her personal bottle while calling for proper medical supplies, her calm professional demeanor providing a stark contrast to Victoria Hayes's continued defensive posturing and refusal to acknowledge the severity of what had occurred. Victoria's immediate response to the crisis revealed the depth of her personal dysfunction and professional incompetence, as she chose to protect herself rather than assist the injured infant, deflecting responsibility with claims about turbulence and passenger behavior that anyone with functioning moral judgment could see were lies designed to avoid accountability. Her radio call to the captain reporting a disruptive passenger rather than a medical emergency created documentation that would later prove crucial in establishing her criminal intent and complete disregard for Jordan's welfare. Margaret Chen found herself in the surreal position of maintaining her undercover status while watching federal crimes being committed in real time, her documentation shifting from routine audit observations to evidence collection for what was clearly going to become a major investigation involving child endangerment and filing false police reports. The contrast between Victoria's lies and the reality that Margaret was witnessing firsthand provided exactly the kind of unimpeachable testimony that could cut through union protection and airline damage control to deliver actual consequences for criminal behavior. Sarah Kim's reaction to the crisis exposed the toxic workplace dynamics that had enabled Victoria's behavior, as the younger flight attendant clearly recognized the inappropriate nature of her supervisor's response but lacked the authority or courage to challenge someone whose union connections and seniority could destroy her career. Margaret watched Sarah struggle with the moral weight of choosing between professional survival and doing the right thing, a conflict that revealed how institutional cultures could corrupt even well-intentioned people through fear and intimidation. James Morrison's transformation from disinterested businessman to horrified witness provided a crucial perspective shift that would prove vital in countering Victoria's inevitable attempts to reframe the incident as passenger misconduct rather than crew negligence. His phone recording of the aftermath captured not only Jordan's injuries and Elijah's desperate attempts to provide comfort, but also Victoria's callous refusal to assist and her immediate pivot to blame deflection rather than emergency response. The other first-class passengers found themselves forced to choose sides in a confrontation that revealed fundamental questions about human decency and moral courage, with some offering assistance and support to Elijah and Jordan, while others seemed more concerned about flight delays and personal inconvenience than about an injured child. Their varied responses provided a microcosm of how society responds to injustice, with some people rising to meet moral challenges, while others retreat into self-interest and willful blindness. Elijah's handling of the crisis demonstrated both his competence as a father and his experience as a civil rights attorney who understood that every word and action was being recorded and would later be scrutinized in legal proceedings. His calm demands for medical assistance and proper emergency response revealed someone who could maintain professional composure even while his child was suffering a combination of paternal love and legal expertise that would prove devastating to Victoria's attempts to portray him as an aggressive or unreasonable passenger. The captain's acceptance of Victoria's false report without independent investigation revealed another layer of institutional failure that allowed discrimination and incompetence to flourish, unchallenged, as authority figures chose to trust crew members over passengers based on assumptions about credibility that often correlated with race and social status, rather than actual evidence or professional judgment. Margaret's decision about when and how to reveal her federal authority became increasingly urgent, as Victoria's behavior escalated from negligence to active cover-up, forcing the undercover inspector to balance the value of continued observation against the immediate need to prevent further harm to Jordan and ensure that accurate documentation reached the proper authorities before union lawyers and airline executives could begin their damage control efforts. The emergency response protocols that should have activated automatically in cases of passenger injury were being deliberately ignored by Victoria, whose training had clearly emphasized liability protection over human welfare, creating a situation where federal safety regulations were being violated in real time, while a child suffered from preventable complications of his injuries. As the remaining flight time ticked away, the cabin atmosphere became increasingly tense with the knowledge that law enforcement would be waiting at the gate and that someone's version of events would determine whether justice was served or whether another case of discrimination and abuse would be buried under institutional protection and legal maneuvering that prioritized corporate interests over human dignity and accountability. The descent into Chicago O'Hare felt like falling into a legal and public relations maelstrom that would reshape multiple lives and careers before the wheels touched the tarmac, as news of the incident began spreading through the airline's communication systems, and Victoria Hayes's confident assumptions about controlling the narrative started colliding with the reality that several witnesses had documented her actions and responses with damning clarity. The captain's announcement about law enforcement boarding the aircraft sent ripples of anticipation through the cabin, but Victoria seemed to believe that her 20 years of seniority and union protection would shield her from meaningful consequences, a delusion that was about to be shattered by forces she hadn't considered. Margaret Chen's decision to maintain her cover until the moment of maximum impact reflected decades of experience in federal investigations, understanding that premature revelation of her authority might allow guilty parties to modify their behavior or coordinate their stories before law enforcement could secure proper evidence and witness statements. Her position in Seat 4B had provided perfect documentation of Victoria's behavior from boarding through the crisis, creating an unshakable foundation of federal testimony that no union lawyer or airline executive would be able to dismiss or discredit. The Chicago Police Department officers who boarded the aircraft were clearly expecting to arrest a disruptive passenger based on Victoria's false report, their aggressive posture and immediate focus on Elijah Thompson revealing how easily law enforcement could be manipulated by crew members who understood how to exploit racial biases and assumptions about credibility. Sergeant Miller's approach to Elijah with handcuffs ready and demands for compliance showed exactly why false police reports were considered serious federal crimes, as innocent people could face violence and imprisonment based on nothing more than lies told by authority figures. Margaret's revelation of her federal status created one of those moments where reality shifted so dramatically that everyone involved had to recalibrate their understanding of what was happening and who held actual power in the situation. The gold badge of the Federal Aviation Administration carried weight that superseded airline policies and union protections, representing the kind of oversight authority that Victoria had probably never encountered in her career, and certainly hadn't anticipated when she chose to commit federal crimes while thinking she was untouchable. Victoria's immediate deflection attempts and claims of conspiracy revealed the depth of her delusion and narcissism, as she apparently believed that even faced with video evidence and federal witness testimony, she could somehow convince law enforcement that the problem was passenger behavior, rather than her own criminal negligence and deliberate cover-up efforts. Her inability to acknowledge Jordan's suffering or take responsibility for causing it demonstrated exactly the kind of moral bankruptcy that made her unfit for any position involving public safety or passenger welfare. James Morrison's video evidence provided crucial corroboration of Margaret's testimony, creating multiple layers of documentation that would make it impossible for airline lawyers to claim that the incident was being exaggerated or misrepresented by biased witnesses. The businessman's footage captured not only the immediate aftermath of the coffee spill, but also Victoria's callous refusal to provide medical assistance and her immediate pivot to blame deflection rather than emergency response. Dr. Patricia Williams's medical assessment of Jordan's injuries provided professional validation of the severity of what Victoria had caused, establishing the legal foundation for charges of child endangerment and assault with serious bodily harm that could result in prison time rather than just employment consequences. The pediatrician's testimony would carry significant weight in both criminal proceedings and civil litigation, providing expert medical opinion about the preventable nature of Jordan's suffering. Sarah Kim's moral breakthrough in finally speaking truth about Victoria's behavior created another crack in the wall of institutional protection that often shielded problematic employees from accountability, showing how individual courage could overcome workplace intimidation when the stakes became high enough to justify personal risk. Her testimony about Victoria's pattern of biased comments and unprofessional conduct would help establish criminal intent and demonstrate that the coffee incident was part of a larger pattern of discrimination rather than an isolated accident. The transformation of Victoria from confident authority figure to handcuffed criminal suspect happened with the kind of poetic justice that rarely occurred in real life, as her assumptions about immunity and protection crumbled in the face of federal oversight and documented evidence that no union lawyer could explain away or minimize. Her perp walk through the cabin where she'd held power over passengers provided a stark reversal of fortune that would be captured by multiple phone cameras and shared across social media within minutes. Elijah's vindication came not from personal revenge, but from the systematic exposure of institutional failures that had enabled Victoria's behavior and the demonstration that accountability was possible when the right witnesses were present and willing to speak truth to power. His legal expertise had prepared him for exactly this kind of confrontation. But seeing justice served in real time provided a different kind of satisfaction than courtroom victories achieved months or years after the fact. The passenger reactions to Victoria's arrest revealed the full spectrum of human responses to injustice being exposed and addressed, from relief and satisfaction among those who had witnessed her cruelty to discomfort and denial, among those who preferred not to acknowledge the reality of discrimination and abuse that had occurred right in front of them throughout the flight. Margaret's satisfaction in seeing federal authority properly exercised to protect innocent victims and hold criminals accountable reflected her understanding that individual investigations could create precedents and consequences that influenced broader institutional behavior, making other employees think twice before engaging in discrimination or abuse of their positions of power over vulnerable passengers. The immediate aftermath of Victoria Hayes's arrest triggered a cascade of institutional responses that revealed how quickly corporate priorities could shift when federal oversight and public attention threatened financial and reputational damage on a scale that no amount of union protection or legal maneuvering could contain. Global Airways executives found themselves facing not just individual criminal prosecution of a problematic employee, but the broader implications of having enabled and protected a pattern of discriminatory behavior that federal investigators were now documenting with the thoroughness that could reshape industry practices and cost millions in settlements and regulatory penalties. CEO Patricia Stone's emergency meeting with her legal team focused on damage control strategies that could minimize the airline's liability while distancing the corporation from Victoria's actions. But Margaret Chen's federal investigation had already uncovered the broader institutional failures that made Victoria's behavior possible and predictable rather than aberrant. The discovery of previous complaint files that had been dismissed without proper investigation revealed a culture of impunity that protected crew members at the expense of passenger safety and civil rights, creating exactly the kind of pattern that federal prosecutors love to pursue under civil rights statutes. Legal Director Robert Nash's review of Victoria's employment file revealed the depth of the airline's liability exposure, as her history of complaints involving minority passengers had been systematically ignored or minimized by supervisors who prioritized crew solidarity over passenger protection. The union's role in shielding Victoria from previous accountability had created a documented trail of institutional racism that would be impossible to defend in either criminal court or civil litigation, forcing the airline to consider settlement strategies that could reach tens of millions of dollars. Union Representative David Kumar's initial attempts to defend Victoria crumbled as the evidence mounted, and other crew members began distancing themselves from her behavior, recognizing that association with criminal conduct could jeopardize their own careers and reputations. The union's standard playbook of challenging passenger credibility and claiming procedural violations became useless when faced with federal testimony and video documentation that made Victoria's guilt undeniable and her behavior indefensible. Margaret's expanded investigation into airline training and oversight protocols revealed gaps in civil rights education and bias prevention that had allowed discrimination to flourish unchallenged throughout the industry, creating opportunities for federal regulatory changes that could affect every major carrier and establish new standards for crew behavior and passenger protection. Her documentation of Victoria's case would become a template for identifying and prosecuting similar patterns of institutional discrimination across the aviation industry. The social media explosion surrounding James Morrison's video created public pressure that amplified the impact of federal investigation and criminal prosecution as millions of viewers witnessed the reality of airline discrimination and demanded accountability that went beyond individual punishment to include wholesale reform of industry practices. The viral nature of the footage meant that no amount of corporate spin or legal maneuvering could control the narrative or minimize the public relations damage that was spreading globally within hours of the incident. Elijah's legal strategy shifted from reactive damage control to proactive civil rights enforcement as he recognized the opportunity to use his son's suffering as a catalyst for broader institutional change that could protect other families from experiencing similar discrimination and abuse. His expertise in federal civil rights litigation provided the perfect complement to Margaret's regulatory authority, creating a two-pronged attack on industry practices that could deliver both individual justice and broader reform. Dr. Patricia Williams's medical documentation of Jordan's injuries provided the foundation for criminal charges of child endangerment and assault that carried serious prison time, establishing legal precedents that would make other airline employees think carefully before allowing personal biases to influence their treatment of passengers. Her professional testimony would be crucial in demonstrating the preventable nature of Jordan's suffering and the criminal negligence that Victoria's behavior represented. The broader aviation industry's response to the incident reflected growing recognition that isolated cases of discrimination could no longer be dismissed as individual failures when federal oversight and social media documentation were creating permanent records of institutional patterns and cover-up attempts. Airlines across the country began reviewing their own training protocols and complaint procedures, recognizing that Victoria's case could easily become their own if they didn't address cultural problems proactively. Sarah Kim's decision to provide truthful testimony about Victoria's pattern of discriminatory behavior created a template for other airline employees to report misconduct without fear of retaliation, as federal protection for whistleblowers became more important than union loyalty when criminal activity was involved. Her courage in speaking truth to power would influence other crew members to prioritize passenger safety and civil rights over workplace solidarity that enabled abuse and discrimination to flourish unchallenged throughout the industry. The deposition proceedings in the glass-walled conference room of Elijah Thompson's downtown Chicago law firm had the sterile intensity of a surgical procedure, with every question designed to extract truth from witnesses who had spent weeks preparing defensive strategies with some of the most expensive legal talent that union dues and airline insurance policies could purchase. Victoria Hayes sat at the mahogany table looking remarkably different from the confident authority figure who had ruled the first-class cabin just months earlier. Her court-mandated appearance stripped of the uniform and manufactured authority that had once made her feel untouchable, replaced by the kind of cheap business attire that suggested someone whose financial resources had been rapidly depleted by legal fees and unemployment. Elijah's decision to conduct the deposition personally rather than delegating to associates reflected both his expertise in discrimination cases and his personal investment in ensuring that every aspect of Victoria's behavior was documented with the precision that would prevent her from ever again wielding authority over vulnerable passengers. His questions cut through the defensive strategies that Victoria's lawyers had presumably rehearsed with her, forcing her to confront specific contradictions between her various statements to police, airline investigators, and union representatives who had been scrambling to construct a coherent defense narrative. The audio evidence from the cockpit voice recorder provided the kind of smoking gun that transformed civil litigation from he said, she said disputes into criminal prosecutions with clear evidence of premeditation and intent to harm. Victoria's recorded comments about teaching Elijah a lesson and using spills to intimidate passengers revealed a level of criminal planning that made her actions legally indefensible and personally reprehensible, creating grounds for federal hate crime charges that carried prison sentences measured in years rather than months. Margaret Chen's testimony as a federal witness provided unshakable credibility that no amount of union loyalty or airline damage control could undermine her decades of experience in aviation safety and civil rights enforcement, lending weight to observations that civilian witnesses might have struggled to present with sufficient authority. Her documentation of Victoria's behavior from boarding through arrest created a comprehensive record that would be impossible for defense attorneys to discredit or reframe as misunderstanding or misinterpretation. Union Representative David Kumar's presence at the deposition reflected the organization's growing recognition that Victoria's case had become indefensible and that continued association with her behavior could jeopardize the union's relationship with both the airline and federal regulators, who were increasingly focused on industry-wide patterns of discrimination and abuse. His visible discomfort with Victoria's recorded statements suggested that even her strongest institutional advocates were beginning to distance themselves from conduct that had crossed clear legal and moral boundaries. Dr. Patricia Williams's medical testimony about Jordan's injuries provided expert validation of the severity of Victoria's actions and the lasting impact on a child who had done nothing more than exist while Black in a space where his presence was deemed threatening by someone whose personal prejudices had overcome professional judgment. Her clinical description of second-degree burns and potential scarring gave legal weight to what might otherwise have been dismissed as minor consequences of an unfortunate accident. James Morrison's video evidence created visual documentation that made Victoria's lies impossible to maintain, as his footage clearly showed her deliberate actions and callous responses, rather than the accidental spill caused by turbulence that her defense team was attempting to claim. The businessman's transformation from disinterested bystander to crucial witness demonstrated how individual moral courage could tip the scales of justice when institutional power was arrayed against victims seeking accountability. Sarah Kim's testimony about Victoria's pattern of discriminatory comments and unprofessional behavior provided crucial context that transformed an isolated incident into evidence of broader bias and criminal intent. Her willingness to speak truth despite workplace retaliation, creating the kind of insider perspective that made union protection strategies irrelevant. Her courage in contradicting her former supervisor's false narrative reflected growing recognition that individual integrity had to take precedence over institutional loyalty when criminal activity was involved. Victoria's continued attempts to maintain innocence and claim victimization, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence, revealed the depth of her narcissism and moral bankruptcy, her inability to acknowledge Jordan's suffering or accept responsibility for her actions, demonstrating exactly why she was unfit for any position involving authority over other human beings. Her defensive responses to questioning created additional grounds for perjury charges that could extend her potential prison sentence significantly. The settlement negotiations that followed the deposition reflected the airline's desperate attempts to limit financial and reputational damage through confidential agreements that would prevent further public scrutiny of their role in enabling Victoria's behavior. But Elijah's refusal to accept silence as part of any agreement ensured that accountability would remain visible and institutional changes would be publicly documented rather than hidden behind non-disclosure agreements. Global Airways executives' realization that their liability exposure extended far beyond individual employee misconduct to include institutional negligence and civil rights violations forced them to consider settlement amounts that reflected the true cost of allowing discrimination to flourish unchallenged with potential damages, reaching levels that would influence airline policies and practices for years to come. The broader implications of Victoria's case for aviation industry practices became clear as other airlines began reviewing their own complaint procedures and training protocols, recognizing that federal oversight and social media documentation had fundamentally changed the consequences of allowing employee bias to influence passenger treatment in ways that could no longer be covered up or minimized through traditional damage control strategies. The final settlement conference took place in a Chicago federal courthouse that had witnessed decades of civil rights battles. its marble halls echoing with the footsteps of lawyers and defendants who had shaped the legal landscape around discrimination and accountability. But few cases had carried the emotional weight and public attention that surrounded Victoria Hayes's spectacular fall from airline authority to criminal defendant facing federal charges that could reshape industry practices across the entire aviation sector. The $8 million settlement figure represented more than just financial compensation for Jordan Thompson's injuries. It was a public acknowledgement that institutional racism carried concrete costs that could no longer be hidden behind union protection and corporate damage control strategies. Victoria's surrender of her flight credentials marked the end of a 20-year career that had given her identity and purpose, but her inability to recognize the broader harm she had caused or demonstrate genuine remorse for her actions revealed someone whose moral development had been stunted by years of unchallenged authority and institutional protection that enabled bias to flourish without consequences. Her mandatory public apology was written by lawyers and delivered without conviction, a performative gesture that satisfied legal requirements while revealing the emptiness of accountability that came through compulsion rather than genuine recognition of wrongdoing. The broader implications for airline industry practices extended far beyond individual punishment to include new federal regulations on crew behavior and passenger protection, with Margaret Chen's investigation providing the foundation for policy changes that would affect training protocols and complaint procedures across every major carrier in the United States. Victoria's case had become a template for federal prosecutors seeking to hold airlines accountable for enabling discrimination through inadequate oversight and protection of problematic employees. Union Representative David Kumar's removal from leadership positions reflected membership recognition that protecting criminal behavior had damaged the organization's credibility and bargaining power with both employers and federal regulators, forcing labor organizations to balance worker protection with public safety and civil rights in ways that prioritized accountability over blind loyalty. The union's new leadership implemented training programs and reporting procedures designed to prevent future cases like Victoria's from developing unchallenged. Global Airways' stock price recovery following the settlement reflected investor confidence that the airline had taken appropriate action to prevent future incidents. But the deeper cultural changes required to eliminate institutional bias would take years to implement and verify through ongoing federal oversight and community monitoring that held corporate promises accountable through measurable outcomes rather than public relations statements. Sarah Kim's promotion to senior flight attendant positions reflected recognition that moral courage in reporting misconduct deserved advancement rather than retaliation. Her experience with Victoria's case, making her an ideal candidate for training programs, focused on bias prevention and passenger protection that prioritized human dignity over crew solidarity when the two came into conflict. Her willingness to speak truth despite workplace pressure had influenced other airline employees to prioritize ethics over institutional loyalty. James Morrison's transition from passive business traveler to active discrimination witness had inspired him to use his corporate connections and financial resources to support civil rights organizations working on aviation equality, his video documentation of Victoria's behavior becoming a powerful tool for educating other travelers about recognizing and responding to bias when they witnessed it during their own journeys. Dr. Patricia Williams's consulting work with airlines on medical emergency procedures reflected growing industry recognition that passenger welfare required more than just safety equipment. It demanded crew members who could respond to crises with compassion and competence, regardless of their personal biases about who deserved help and protection when vulnerable people needed assistance. Margaret Chen's expanded role in federal aviation oversight reflected the success of her investigation in documenting institutional patterns that went beyond individual employee misconduct to include broader cultural failures that enabled discrimination to flourish unchallenged. her expertise becoming crucial for developing regulatory strategies that could prevent future cases through proactive intervention rather than reactive punishment. Victoria's post-conviction life in a small Midwest town where nobody knew her history provided the kind of anonymity that allowed for potential personal growth, but her continued refusal to acknowledge the full scope of her actions or demonstrate genuine empathy for Jordan's suffering suggested someone whose character had been too thoroughly corrupted by years of unchecked authority to benefit from the second chances that true redemption would require. The financial devastation that accompanied Victoria's legal troubles reflected the real-world consequences of criminal behavior that extended far beyond employment termination to include legal fees, civil judgments, and unemployability that would affect her economic prospects for the rest of her life, creating the kind of personal accountability that institutional protection had previously prevented from reaching employees who abused their positions. Elijah's decision to donate half the settlement to Northwestern Children's Hospital's burn unit created lasting benefits that would help other families facing similar medical crises, transforming Jordan's suffering into a resource for healing that would serve children for generations, while ensuring that the financial consequences of discrimination would benefit the communities most often targeted by institutional bias and individual prejudice. 2 years after the incident that had transformed their lives in ways both devastating and redemptive, Elijah Thompson stood in the bright lobby of Northwestern Memorial Hospital's new pediatric burn unit, watching his now 2.5-year-old son Jordan toddle between the colorful play equipment with the boundless energy and infectious laughter that had become his trademark since recovering from the trauma that had once threatened to define his early childhood. The silver-haired scar on Jordan's left arm was barely visible now, thanks to the best medical care that settlement money could provide, but more importantly, the psychological resilience that his father had helped him develop had turned a moment of cruelty into a foundation for extraordinary confidence and compassion. The hospital dedication ceremony was taking place in a wing that bore a discreet plaque, acknowledging the Thompson family's contribution. But Elijah had insisted that the focus remain on the children who would benefit from the advanced burn treatment facilities, rather than on the legal case that had made the donation possible. Jordan's recovery had been remarkable not just medically, but emotionally, as he showed no signs of fear around strangers or anxiety in crowded spaces, his natural curiosity and trust in the world apparently undiminished by what he had experienced as an infant. Margaret Chen's presence at the ceremony reflected her continued oversight of aviation industry reforms that had grown from her initial investigation into a comprehensive federal initiative addressing discrimination and bias prevention across all major airlines. Her expertise becoming instrumental in developing training programs that emphasized both passenger safety and civil rights protection as inseparable aspects of professional aviation service. Her satisfaction in seeing concrete improvements in industry practices validated the importance of individual courage in confronting institutional failures. The unexpected encounter that would reshape everyone's understanding of redemption and forgiveness began when Elijah noticed a woman in volunteer clothing helping children navigate the physical therapy equipment with gentle patience and obvious experience working with young burn victims. Something about her movements seemed familiar, but it wasn't until she turned around that he recognized Victoria Hayes, looking older and somehow smaller than he remembered her face, showing the kind of genuine concern for the children's welfare that had been completely absent during their confrontation on the aircraft. Victoria's recognition of Elijah and Jordan created one of those moments where time seemed suspended as both adults processed the surreal nature of their unexpected reunion in a place dedicated to healing children who had suffered exactly the kind of injuries that Victoria had once inflicted without apparent remorse. Her initial impulse was clearly to flee, but something in Elijah's expression, not anger or satisfaction, but rather a kind of weary curiosity, made her pause and remain present for a conversation that neither of them had anticipated or prepared for. The transformation in Victoria's demeanor was immediately apparent to anyone who had witnessed her previous arrogance and defensiveness replaced by a quiet humility and genuine engagement with the children that suggested someone who had undergone fundamental changes in character and perspective during the 2 years since her conviction. Her volunteer work at the burn unit wasn't court-mandated community service, but rather personal choice that reflected whatever internal process had led her to seek meaningful ways to contribute to healing rather than causing harm. Jordan's innocent interaction with Victoria provided the emotional breakthrough that allowed both adults to move beyond their fixed roles as perpetrator and victim toward something more complex and ultimately more healing for everyone involved. The toddler's natural friendliness and lack of fear showed Elijah that his son had indeed escaped lasting psychological damage from the incident, while Victoria's gentle response to the child revealed whatever capacity for redemption and growth might still exist in someone whose actions had once seemed unforgivably cruel. Elijah's decision to engage in actual conversation with Victoria rather than simply walking away reflected both his professional understanding of restorative justice principles and his personal recognition that forgiveness might serve Jordan's long-term interests better than continued anger and resentment. Their discussion revealed that Victoria had spent the past 2 years in therapy and community service working to understand the biases and personal failures that had led to her criminal behavior while trying to find ways to make amends that went beyond legal requirements. Victoria's acknowledgement of the full scope of harm she had caused, not just to Jordan and Elijah, but to their family's sense of safety and trust in public spaces, demonstrated the kind of complete accountability that had been absent from her court-ordered apology, but was essential for any genuine process of redemption and healing. Her understanding that forgiveness was something to be earned rather than demanded showed growth that surprised Elijah and created possibilities for closure that neither of them had previously imagined. The hospital setting provided perfect context for a conversation about healing that extended beyond physical recovery to include the emotional and moral dimensions of overcoming trauma and rebuilding trust in human decency. Victoria's work with burn victims had apparently taught her about resilience and recovery in ways that her previous career in aviation had never addressed, giving her practical experience with the consequences of preventable injuries and the importance of compassionate care in helping children and families recover from devastating experiences. Margaret Chen's observation of the encounter between Elijah and Victoria provided professional perspective on how individual accountability and institutional reform could work together to create lasting change that benefited entire communities, rather than simply punishing wrongdoers without addressing the broader cultural factors that had enabled their harmful behavior. Her documentation of both punishment and redemption in Victoria's case would influence federal guidelines for addressing discrimination in ways that emphasized restoration and prevention rather than purely punitive approaches. The conclusion of their unexpected conversation left both Elijah and Victoria changed in ways that would influence their future choices and relationships, with Elijah feeling a sense of completion and closure that had been missing despite his legal victories, while Victoria gained something she hadn't dared hope for. Not absolution for her actions, but recognition that people could grow beyond their worst moments if they were willing to do the difficult work of genuine change and accountability. The ripple effects of Jordan Thompson's story continued to spread through the aviation industry and beyond, creating lasting changes that transformed not only individual careers and institutional policies, but also the broader cultural conversations around bias accountability and the possibility of genuine redemption when people were willing to confront their worst impulses and work toward becoming better versions of themselves. Sarah Kim's rise to senior management positions within the airline industry reflected growing recognition that moral courage and ethical leadership were essential qualifications for advancement. Her experience with Victoria's case making her uniquely qualified to develop training programs that helped other crew members recognize and interrupt discriminatory behavior before it escalated to criminal levels. James Morrison's transformation from passive business traveler to active civil rights advocate had led him to establish a foundation that provided legal support and documentation resources for families facing discrimination during air travel. His personal wealth and corporate connections creating opportunities for change that individual victims might not have been able to achieve on their own. His video of Victoria's behavior had become a powerful training tool used by airlines and federal regulators to demonstrate how quickly professional situations could deteriorate when bias was allowed to override basic human decency and safety protocols. Dr. Patricia Williams's consulting work with major airlines had resulted in comprehensive medical emergency protocols that prioritized passenger welfare over liability concerns. Her pediatric expertise helping to develop crew training that emphasized compassionate care for vulnerable travelers regardless of their race, age, or social status. Her willingness to intervene during Jordan's crisis had inspired other medical professionals to speak up when they witnessed discrimination or negligence during their own travel experiences. Margaret Chen's expanded federal oversight responsibilities had grown into a national program addressing workplace bias and discrimination across multiple transportation sectors, her success in documenting and prosecuting Victoria's case providing a model for investigating institutional patterns that enabled individual misconduct to flourish unchallenged. Her retirement party would eventually include testimonials from dozens of families whose lives had been improved by regulatory changes that grew from her patient documentation of seemingly isolated incidents. The union reforms that followed Victoria's case had resulted in new leadership and policies that balanced worker protection with passenger safety and civil rights, recognizing that defending criminal behavior ultimately weakened labor organizations by destroying public trust and regulatory cooperation. David Kamar's replacement had implemented reporting procedures and training programs that helped union members understand their professional and moral obligations to prevent discrimination, rather than cover it up after the fact. Victoria's continued volunteer work at burn units and community centers reflected whatever genuine transformation had occurred during her legal troubles and personal reckoning, though her impact remained limited by the reality that trust and credibility had to be rebuilt slowly through consistent actions rather than dramatic gestures. Her story served as a complex example of how accountability and consequences could sometimes lead to genuine growth, even when the original harm had seemed unforgivable. Elijah's expanded civil rights practice had grown to include aviation discrimination as a specialty area, his expertise and personal experience making him uniquely effective at holding airlines accountable for bias and negligence, while helping other families navigate the complex legal and emotional challenges of seeking justice when their children had been harmed by institutional failures. Jordan's story had become a powerful tool for educating juries and judges about the real-world impact of discrimination on young victims who deserved protection rather than prejudice. The broader cultural impact of Jordan's case extended beyond aviation to include workplace training programs and diversity initiatives that used his story to demonstrate how individual biases could escalate into criminal behavior when unchecked by appropriate oversight and accountability mechanisms. His experience had become a teaching tool for helping people recognize their own prejudices and develop the skills necessary to interrupt discriminatory behavior before it caused irreversible harm to innocent victims. Federal regulations that grew from Margaret Chen's investigation had created new standards for crew training and passenger protection that influenced international aviation policies, with other countries adopting similar oversight mechanisms to prevent the kind of institutional discrimination that had enabled Victoria's behavior. The global impact of one child's suffering had created positive changes that would protect countless other families from experiencing similar trauma and injustice. The final scene of transformation occurred 5 years after the original incident, as Elijah and Jordan boarded another flight together for a family vacation, their interaction with the crew reflecting the cultural changes that had made aviation safer and more welcoming for all passengers, regardless of their background or appearance. Jordan's confidence and curiosity during the boarding process showed how children could overcome early trauma when they were surrounded by love, support, and evidence that justice was possible, even in situations that initially seemed hopeless. The respectful and professional treatment they received from flight attendants who knew their story demonstrated how individual accountability and institutional reform could work together to create lasting change that honored both the victims of discrimination and the possibility that people and organizations could grow beyond their worst moments when they were willing to do the difficult work of genuine transformation and accountability. 5 years later, Jordan starts kindergarten with confidence and kindness that radiates from a child who has been loved unconditionally and protected fiercely by a father who turned personal tragedy into a movement for justice. The discrimination he faced as an infant became the foundation for changes that revolutionized how airlines train their staff and respond to bias. His story inspiring hundreds of other families to speak up against unfair treatment instead of accepting it as the price of traveling while different. Victoria now runs youth programs teaching empathy and conflict resolution in underserved communities, her transformation from perpetrator to advocate, proving that accountability, when met with genuine remorse and sustained effort to change, can create powerful healing for both victims and those who have caused harm. She carries Jordan's story not as shame that defines her, but as responsibility that drives her daily commitment to ensure that other children never experience the cruelty she once inflicted without thinking about consequences. Sometimes the most important witness isn't the one with the loudest voice, but the one with the clearest vision of what justice should look like, and the courage to document truth when powerful people are lying to protect themselves. Margaret Chen's quiet observation turned a moment of cruelty into a catalyst for lasting reform, proving that those who watch